Textbook in History for Class 12. Themes in Indian History. Foreword. The National Curriculum Framework, NCF, 2005, recommends that children's life at school must be linked to their life outside the school. This principle marks a departure from the legacy of bookish learning which continues to shape our system and causes a gap between the school, home, and community. The syllabi and textbooks developed on the basis of NCF signify an attempt to implement this basic idea. They also attempt to discourage rote learning and the maintenance of sharp boundaries between different subject areas. We hope these measures will take us significantly further in the direction of a child-centered system of education outlined in the National Policy on Education, 1986. The success of this effort depends on the steps that school principals and teachers will take to encourage children to reflect on their own learning and to pursue imaginative activities and questions. We must recognize that, given space, time and freedom, children generate new knowledge by engaging with the information passed on to them by adults. Treating the prescribed textbook as the sole basis of examination is one of the key reasons why other resources and sites of learning are ignored. Inculcating creativity and initiative is possible if we perceive and treat children as participants in learning, not as receivers of a fixed body of knowledge. These aims imply considerable change in school routines and mode of functioning. Flexibility in the daily timetable is as necessary as rigor in implementing the annual calendars so that the required number of teaching days are actually devoted to teaching. The methods used for teaching and evaluation will also determine how effective this textbook proves for making children's life at school a happy experience, rather than a source of stress or boredom. Syllabus designers have tried to address the problem of curricular burden by restructuring and reorienting knowledge at different stages with greater consideration for child psychology and the time available for teaching. The textbook attempts to enhance this endeavor by giving higher priority and space to opportunities for contemplation and wondering, discussion in small groups, and activities requiring hands-on experience. The National Council of Educational Research and Training, NCERT, appreciates the hard work done by the Textbook Development Committee responsible for this book. We wish to thank the chairperson of the advisory group in social sciences Professor Hari Vasudevan and the chief advisor for this book, Professor Neeladri Bhattacharya, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi for guiding the work of this committee. Several teachers contributed to the development of this textbook. We are grateful to their principals for making this possible. We are indebted to the institutions and organizations which have generously permitted us to draw upon their resources, material, and personnel. We are especially grateful to the members of the National Monitoring Committee, appointed by the Department of Secondary and Higher Education, Ministry of Human Resource Development under the chairpersonship of Professor Mrinal Miri and Professor G.P. Deshpande, for their valuable time and contribution. As an organization committed to the systemic reform and continuous improvement in the quality of its products, NCERT welcomes comments and suggestions which will enable us to undertake further revision and refinement. Director, National Council of Educational Research and Training, New Delhi, November 20, 2006. Defining the focus of study. What defines the focus of this book? What does it seek to do? How is it linked to what has been studied in earlier classes? In classes 6 to 8 we looked at Indian history from early beginnings to modern times, with a focus on one chronological period in each year. Then in the books for classes 9 and 10, the frame of reference changed. We looked at a shorter period of time, focusing specifically on a close study of the contemporary world. We moved beyond territorial boundaries, beyond the limits of nation-states, to see how different people in different places have played their part in the making of the modern world. The history of India became connected to a wider interlinked history. Subsequently in Class 9 we studied themes in world history, expanding our chronological focus, looking at the vast span of years from the beginning of human life to the present, but selecting only a set of themes for serious exploration. This year we will study themes in Indian history. The book begins with Harappa and ends with the framing of the Indian Constitution. What it offers is not a general survey of 5 millennia, but a close study of select themes. The history books in earlier years have already acquainted you with Indian history. It is time we explore some themes in greater detail. In choosing the themes, we have tried to ensure that we learn about developments in different spheres: economic, cultural, social, political, and religious, even as we attempt to break the boundaries between them. Some themes in the book will introduce you to the politics of the time and the nature of authority and power, others explore the way societies are organized, and the way they function and change, still others tell us about religious life and ritual practices, about the working of economies, and the changes within rural and urban societies. Each of these themes will also allow you to have a closer look at the historian's craft. To retrieve the past, historians have to find sources that makes the past accessible. But sources do not just reveal the past, historians have to grapple with sources, interpret them, and make them speak. This is what makes history exciting. The same sources can tell us new things if we ask new questions, and engage with them in new ways. So we need to see how historians read sources, and how they discover new things in old sources. But historians do not only re-examine old records. They discover new ones. Sometimes these could be chance discoveries. Archaeologists may unexpectedly come across seals and mounds that provide clues to the existence of a site of an ancient civilization. Rummaging through the dusty records of a district collectorate, a historian may trip over a bundle of records that contain legal cases of local disputes, and these may open up a new world of village life several centuries back. Yet are such discoveries only accidents? You may bump into a bundle of old records in an archive, open it up and see it, without discovering the significance of the source. The source may mean nothing to you unless you have relevant questions in mind. You have to track the source, read the text, follow the clues, and make the interconnections before you can reconstruct the past. The physical discovery of a record does not simply open up the past. When Alexander Cunningham first saw a Harappan seal, he could make no sense of it. Only much later was the significance of the seals discovered. In fact, when historians begin to ask new questions, explore new themes, they have to often search for new types of sources. If we wish to know about revolutionaries and rebels, official sources can reveal only a partial picture, one that will be shaped by official censure and prejudice. We need to look for other sources: diaries of rebels, their personal letters, their writings and pronouncements. And these are not always easy to come by. If we have to understand experiences of people who suffered the trauma of partition, then oral sources might reveal more than written sources. As the vision of history broadens, historians begin tracking new sources, searching for new clues to understand the past. And when that happens, the conception of what constitutes a source itself changes. There was a time when only written records were acknowledged as authentic. What was written could be verified, cited, and cross-checked. Oral evidence was never considered a valid source. Who was to guarantee its authenticity and verifiability? This mistrust of oral sources has not yet disappeared, but oral evidence has been innovatively used to uncover experiences that no other record could reveal. Through the book this year, you will enter the world of historians, accompany them in their search for new clues, and see how they carry on their dialogues with the past. You will witness the way they tease out meaning out of records, read inscriptions, excavate archaeological sites, make sense of beads and bones, interpret the epics, look at the stupas and buildings, examine paintings and photographs, interpret police reports and revenue records, and listen to the voices of the past. Each theme will explore the peculiarities and possibilities of one particular type of source. It will discuss what a source can tell and what it cannot. This is part 1 of Themes in Indian History. Parts 2 and 3 will follow. Neeladri Bhattacharya, Chief Advisor, History. Themes in Indian History by NCERT. Contents. Part 1. Theme 1. Bricks, Beads, and Bones, the Harappan Civilization. Theme 2. Kings, Farmers, and Towns, Early States and Economies. c. 600 BCE to 600 CE. Theme 3. Kinship, Caste, and Class, Early Societies. c. 600 BCE to 600 CE. Theme 4. Thinkers, Beliefs, and Buildings. Cultural Developments. c. 600 BCE to 600 CE. Part 2. Theme 5. Perceptions of Society. c. 10th to 17th centuries. Theme 6. Bhakti Sufi traditions. Changes in religious beliefs and devotional texts, c. 8th to 18th centuries. Theme 7. An imperial capital, Vijayanagara, c. 14th to 16th centuries. Theme 8. Agrarian society and the Mughal Empire, c. 16th-17th centuries. Theme 9. Kings and Chronicles, the Mughal courts, c. 16th-17th centuries. Part 3. Theme 10. Colonialism and the countryside, exploring official archives. Theme 11. Rebels and the Raj. 1857 Revolt and its representations. Theme 12. Colonial cities, urbanization, planning, and architecture. Theme 13. Mahatma Gandhi and the nationalist movement, civil disobedience and beyond. Theme 14. Politics, memories, experiences. Theme 15. Framing the Constitution, the beginning of a new era. Theme 1. Bricks, beads, and bones. The Harappan civilization. The Harappan seal is possibly the most distinctive artifact of the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization. Made of a stone called steatite, seals like this one often contain animal motifs and signs from a script that remains undeciphered. Yet we know a great deal about the lives of the people who lived in the region from what they left behind: their houses, pots, ornaments, tools and seals, in other words, from archaeological evidence. Let us see what we know about the Harappan civilization, and how we know about it. We will explore how archaeological material is interpreted and how interpretations sometimes change. Of course, there are some aspects of the civilization that are as yet unknown and may even remain so. Terms, places, times. The Indus Valley civilization is also called the Harappan culture. Archaeologists use the term culture for a group of objects, distinctive in style, that are usually found together within a specific geographical area and period of time. In the case of the Harappan culture, these distinctive objects include seals, beads, weights, stone blades and even baked bricks. These objects were found from areas as far apart as Afghanistan, Jammu, Baluchistan, Pakistan, and Gujarat. Named after Harappa, the first site where this unique culture was discovered, the civilization is dated between c. 2600 and 1900 BCE. There were earlier and later cultures, often called early Harappan and late Harappan, in the same area. The Harappan civilization is sometimes called the mature Harappan culture to distinguish it from these cultures. 1. Beginnings. There were several archaeological cultures in the region prior to the mature Harappan. These cultures were associated with distinctive pottery, evidence of agriculture and pastoralism, and some crafts. Settlements were generally small, and there were virtually no large buildings. It appears that there was a break between the early Harappan and the Harappan civilization, evident from large-scale burning at some sites, as well as the abandonment of certain settlements. 2. Subsistence strategies. If you look at maps 1 and 2, you will notice that the mature Harappan culture developed in some of the areas occupied by the early Harappan cultures. These cultures also shared certain common elements, including subsistence strategies. The Harappans ate a wide range of plant and animal products, including fish. Archaeologists have been able to reconstruct dietary practices from finds of charred grains and seeds. These are studied by archaeobotanists, who are specialists in ancient plant remains. Grains found at Harappan sites include wheat, barley, lentil, chickpea, and sesame. Millets are found from sites in Gujarat. Finds of rice are relatively rare. Animal bones found at Harappan sites include those of cattle, sheep, goat, buffalo, and pig. Studies done by archaeozoologists or zoorcheologists indicate that these animals were domesticated. Bones of wild species such as boar, deer, and gharial are also found. We do not know whether the Harappans hunted these animals themselves or obtained meat from other hunting communities. Bones of fish and fowl are also found. 2.1 Agricultural technologies. While the prevalence of agriculture is indicated by finds of grain, it is more difficult to reconstruct actual agricultural practices. Were seeds broadcast, scattered, on plowed lands? Representations on seals and terracotta sculpture indicate that the bull was known, and archaeologists extrapolate from this that oxen were used for plowing. Moreover, terracotta models of the plow have been found at sites in Kolistan and at Banawali, Haryana. Archaeologists have also found evidence of a plowed field at Kalabangan, Rajasthan, associated with early Harappan levels. The field had two sets of furrows at right angles to each other, suggesting that two different crops were grown together. Archaeologists have also tried to identify the tools used for harvesting. Did the Harappans use stone blades set in wooden handles or did they use metal tools? Most Harappan sites are located in semi-arid lands, where irrigation was probably required for agriculture. Traces of canals have been found at the Harappan site of Shorchugai in Afghanistan, but not in Punjab or Sindh. It is possible that ancient canals silted up long ago. It is also likely that water drawn from wells was used for irrigation. Besides, water reservoirs found in Dholavira, Gujarat, may have been used to store water for agriculture. 3. Mohenjo-daro, a planned urban center. Perhaps the most unique feature of the Harappan civilization was the development of urban centers. Let us look at one such center, Mohenjo-daro, more closely. Although Mohenjo-daro is the most well-known site, the first site to be discovered was Harappa. The settlement is divided into two sections, one smaller but higher and the other much larger but lower. Archaeologists designate these as the citadel and the lower town respectively. The citadel owes its height to the fact that buildings were constructed on mud brick platforms. It was walled, which meant that it was physically separated from the lower town. The lower town was also walled. Several buildings were built on platforms, which served as foundations. It has been calculated that if one laborer moved roughly a cubic meter of earth daily, just to put the foundations in place, it would have required 4 million personas, in other words, mobilizing labor on a very large scale. Consider something else. Once the platforms were in place, all building activity within the city was restricted to a fixed area on the platforms. So it seems that the settlement was first planned and then implemented accordingly. Other signs of planning include bricks, which, whether sun-dried or baked, were of a standardized ratio, where the length and breadth were 4 times and twice the height respectively. Such bricks were used at all Harappan settlements. 3.1 Laying out drains. One of the most distinctive features of Harappan cities was the carefully planned drainage system. If you look at the plan of the lower town, you will notice that roads and streets were laid out along an approximate grid pattern, intersecting at right angles. It seems that streets with drains were laid out first and then houses built along them. If domestic wastewater had to flow into the street drains, every house needed to have at least one wall along a street. 3.2 Domestic architecture. The lower town at Mohenjo-daro provides examples of residential buildings. Many were centered on a courtyard, with rooms on all sides. The courtyard was probably the center of activities such as cooking and weaving, particularly during hot and dry weather. What is also interesting is an apparent concern for privacy. There are no windows in the walls along the ground level. Besides, the main entrance does not give a direct view of the interior or the courtyard. Every house had its own bathroom paved with bricks, with drains connected through the wall to the street drains. Some houses have remains of staircases to reach a second story or the roof. Many houses had wells, often in a room that could be reached from the outside and perhaps used by passers-by. Scholars have estimated that the total number of wells in Mohenjo-daro was about 700. 3.3 The Citadel. It is on the citadel that we find evidence of structures that were probably used for special public purposes. These include the warehouse, a massive structure of which the lower brick portions remain, while the upper portions, probably of wood, decayed long ago. And the Great Bath. The Great Bath was a large rectangular tank in a courtyard surrounded by a corridor on all four sides. There were 2 flights of steps on the north and south leading into the tank, which was made watertight by setting bricks on edge and using a mortar of gypsum. There were rooms on 3 sides, in one of which was a large well. Water from the tank flowed into a huge drain. Across a lane to the north lay a smaller building with 8 bathrooms, 4 on each side of a corridor, with drains from each bathroom connecting to a drain that ran along the corridor. The uniqueness of the structure, as well as the context in which it was found, the citadel, with several distinctive buildings, has led scholars to suggest that it was meant for some kind of a special ritual bath. 4. Tracking social differences. 4.1 Burials. Archaeologists generally use certain strategies to find out whether there were social or economic differences amongst people living within a particular culture. These include studying burials. You are probably familiar with the massive pyramids of Egypt, some of which were contemporaneous with the Harappan civilization. Many of these pyramids were royal burials, where enormous quantities of wealth was buried. At burials in Harappan sites, the dead were generally laid in pits. Sometimes, there were differences in the way the burial pit was made. In some instances, the hollowed-out spaces were lined with bricks. Could these variations be an indication of social differences? We are not sure. Some graves contain pottery and ornaments, perhaps indicating a belief that these could be used in the afterlife. Jewelry has been found in burials of both men and women. In fact, in the excavations at the cemetery in Harappa in the MID 1980s, an ornament consisting of 3 shell rings, a jasper, a kind of semi-precious stone, bead and hundreds of micro-beads was found near the skull of a male. In some instances the dead were buried with copper mirrors. But on the whole, it appears that the Harappans did not believe in burying precious things with the dead. 4.2 Looking for luxuries. Another strategy to identify social differences is to study artifacts, which archaeologists broadly classify as utilitarian and luxuries. The first category includes objects of daily use made fairly easily out of ordinary materials such as stone or clay. These include querns, pottery, needles, flesh rubbers, body scrubbers, etc., and are usually found distributed throughout settlements. Archaeologists assume objects were luxuries if they are rare or made from costly, non-local materials or with complicated technologies. Thus, little pots of faience, a material made of ground sand or silica mixed with color in a gum and then fired, were probably considered precious because they were difficult to make. The situation becomes more complicated when we find what seem to be articles of daily use, such as spindle whorls made of rare materials such as faience. Do we classify these as utilitarian or luxuries? If we study the distribution of such artifacts, we find that rare objects made of valuable materials are generally concentrated in large settlements like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and are rarely found in the smaller settlements. For example, miniature pots of faience, perhaps used as perfume bottles, are found mostly in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and there are none from small settlements like Kalibangan. Gold too was rare, and as at present, probably precious. All the gold jewelry found at Harappan sites was recovered from hoards. 5. Finding out about craft production. Locate Shanhudaro on Map 1. This is a tiny settlement, less than 7 hectares, as compared to Mohenjo-daro, 125 hectares, almost exclusively devoted to craft production, including bead making, shell cutting, metalworking, seal making and weight making. The variety of materials used to make beads is remarkable: stones like carnelian, of a beautiful red color, jasper, crystal, quartz, and steatite, metals like copper, bronze, and gold, and shell, faience, and terracotta or burnt clay. Some beads were made of 2 or more stones, cemented together, some of stone with gold caps. The shapes were numerous: disc-shaped, cylindrical, spherical, barrel-shaped, segmented. Some were decorated by incising or painting, and some had designs etched onto them. Techniques for making beads differed according to the material. Steatite, a very soft stone, was easily worked. Some beads were molded out of a paste made with steatite powder. This permitted making a variety of shapes, unlike the geometrical forms made out of harder stones. How the steatite microbead was made remains a puzzle for archaeologists studying ancient technology. Archaeologists' experiments have revealed that the red color of carnelian was obtained by firing the yellowish raw material and beads at various stages of production. Nodules were chipped into rough shapes, and then finely flaked into the final form. Grinding, polishing, and drilling completed the process. Specialized drills have been found at Shanhudero, Lethal and more recently at Tholavara. If you locate Nageshwar and Balakot on Map 1, you will notice that both settlements are near the coast. These were specialized centers for making shell objects including bangles, ladles, and inlay which were taken to other settlements. Similarly, it is likely that finished products, such as beads, from Shanhudero and Lethal were taken to the large urban centers such as Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. 5.1 Identifying centers of production. In order to identify centers of craft production, archaeologists usually look for the following: raw materials such as stone nodules, whole shells, copper ore, tools, unfinished objects, rejects and waste material. In fact, waste is one of the best indicators of craft work. For instance, if shell or stone is cut to make objects, then pieces of these materials will be discarded as waste at the place of production. Sometimes, larger waste pieces were used up to make smaller objects, but minuscule bits were usually left in the work area. These traces suggest that apart from small, specialized centers, craft production was also undertaken in large cities such as Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. 6. Strategies for procuring materials. As is obvious, a variety of materials was used for craft production. While some such as clay were locally available, many such as stone, timber, and metal had to be procured from outside the alluvial plain. Terracotta toy models of bullock carts suggest that this was one important means of transporting goods and people across land routes. Riverine routes along the Indus and its tributaries, as well as coastal routes, were also probably used. 6.1 Materials from the subcontinent and beyond. The Harappans procured materials for craft production in various ways. For instance, they established settlements such as Nageshwar and Balakot in areas where shell was available. Other such sites were Shorchugai, in Farah, Afghanistan, near the best source of lapis lazuli, a blue stone that was apparently very highly valued, and Lethal, which was near sources of carnelian, from Bharuch in Gujarat, steatite, from South Rajasthan and North Gujarat, and metal, from Rajasthan. Another strategy for procuring raw materials may have been to send expeditions to areas such as the Khetri region of Rajasthan, for copper, and South India, for gold. These expeditions established communication with local communities. Occasional finds of Harappan artifacts such as steatite microbeads in these areas are indications of such contact. There is evidence in the Khetri area for what archaeologists call the Ganeshwar-Jodhpura culture, with its distinctive non-Harappan pottery and an unusual wealth of copper objects. It is possible that the inhabitants of this region supplied copper to the Harappans. 6.2 Contact with distant lands. Recent archaeological finds suggest that copper was also probably brought from Oman, on the southeastern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Chemical analyses have shown that both the Omani copper and Harappan artifacts have traces of nickel, suggesting a common origin. There are other traces of contact as well. A distinctive type of vessel, a large Harappan jar coated with a thick layer of black clay, has been found at Omani sites. Such thick coatings prevent the percolation of liquids. We do not know what was carried in these vessels, but it is possible that the Harappans exchanged the contents of these vessels for Omani copper. Mesopotamian texts datable to the 3rd millennium BCE refer to copper coming from a region called Magan, perhaps a name for Oman, and interestingly enough, copper found at Mesopotamian sites also contains traces of nickel. Other archaeological finds suggestive of long-distance contacts include Harappan seals, weights, dice and beads. In this context, it is worth noting that Mesopotamian texts mention contact with regions named Dilmun, probably the island of Bahrain, Magan, and Malaha, possibly the Harappan region. They mention the products from Malaha, carnelian, lapis lazuli, copper, gold, and varieties of wood. A Mesopotamian myth says of Malaha, "May your bird be the Hajja bird, may its call be heard in the royal palace." Some archaeologists think the Hajja bird was the peacock. Did it get this name from its call? It is likely that communication with Oman, Bahrain, or Mesopotamia was by sea. Mesopotamian texts refer to Malaha as a land of seafarers. Besides, we find depictions of ships and boats on seals. 7. Seals, script, weights. 7.1 Seals and sealings. Seals and sealings were used to facilitate long-distance communication. Imagine a bag of goods being sent from one place to another. Its mouth was tied with rope and on the knot was affixed some wet clay on which one or more seals were pressed, leaving an impression. If the bag reached with its sealing intact, it meant that it had not been tampered with. The sealing also conveyed the identity of the sender. 7.2 An enigmatic script. Harappan seals usually have a line of writing, probably containing the name and title of the owner. Scholars have also suggested that the motif, generally an animal, conveyed a meaning to those who could not read. Most inscriptions are short, the longest containing about 26 signs. Although the script remains undeciphered to date, it was evidently not alphabetical, where each sign stands for a vowel or a consonant, as it has just too many signs somewhere between 375 and 400. It is apparent that the script was written from right to left, as some seals show a wider spacing on the right and cramping on the left, as if the engraver began working from the right and then ran out of space. Consider the variety of objects on which writing has been found: seals, copper tools, rims of jars, copper and terracotta tablets, jewelry, bone rods, even an ancient signboard. Remember, there may have been writing on perishable materials too. Could this mean that literacy was widespread? 7.3 Weights. Exchanges were regulated by a precise system of weights, usually made of a stone called chert and generally cubical, with no markings. The lower denominations of weights were binary, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. up to 12,800, while the higher denominations followed the decimal system. The smaller weights were probably used for weighing jewelry and beads. Metal scale pans have also been found. 8. Ancient authority. There are indications of complex decisions being taken and implemented in Harappan society. Take for instance, the extraordinary uniformity of Harappan artifacts as evident in pottery, seals, weights and bricks. Notably, bricks, though obviously not produced in any single center, were of a uniform ratio throughout the region, from Jammu to Gujarat. We have also seen that settlements were strategically set up in specific locations for various reasons. Besides, labor was mobilized for making bricks and for the construction of massive walls and platforms. Who organized these activities? 8.1 Palaces and kings. If we look for a center of power or for depictions of people in power, archaeological records provide no immediate answers. A large building found at Mohenjo-daro was labeled as a palace by archaeologists, but no spectacular finds were associated with it. A stone statue was labeled and continues to be known as the priest king. This is because archaeologists were familiar with Mesopotamian history and its priest kings and have found parallels in the Indus region. But as we will see, the ritual practices of the Harappan civilization are not well understood yet, nor are there any means of knowing whether those who performed them also held political power. Some archaeologists are of the opinion that Harappan society had no rulers, and that everybody enjoyed equal status. Others feel there was no single ruler but several, that Mohenjo-daro had a separate ruler, Harappa another, and so forth. Yet others argue that there was a single state, given the similarity in artifacts, the evidence for planned settlements, the standardized ratio of brick size, and the establishment of settlements near sources of raw material. As of now, the last theory seems the most plausible, as it is unlikely that entire communities could have collectively made and implemented such complex decisions. 9. The end of the civilization. There is evidence that by c. 1800 BCE most of the mature Harappan sites in regions such as Kholistan had been abandoned. Simultaneously, there was an expansion of population into new settlements in Gujarat, Haryana, and western Uttar Pradesh. In the few Harappan sites that continued to be occupied after 1900 BCE there appears to have been a transformation of material culture, marked by the disappearance of the distinctive artifacts of the civilization: weights, seals, special beads. Writing, long-distance trade, and craft specialization also disappeared. In general, far fewer materials were used to make far fewer things. House construction techniques deteriorated and large public structures were no longer produced. Overall, artifacts and settlements indicate a rural way of life in what are called late Harappan or successor cultures. What brought about these changes? Several explanations have been put forward. These range from climatic change, deforestation, excessive floods, the shifting and/or drying up of rivers, to overuse of the landscape. Some of these causes may hold for certain settlements, but they do not explain the collapse of the entire civilization. It appears that a strong unifying element, perhaps the Harappan state, came to an end. This is evidenced by the disappearance of seals, the script, distinctive beads, and pottery, the shift from a standardized weight system to the use of local weights, and the decline and abandonment of cities. The subcontinent would have to wait for over a millennium for new cities to develop in a completely different region. 10. Discovering the Harappan civilization. So far, we have examined facets of the Harappan civilization in the context of how archaeologists have used evidence from material remains to piece together parts of a fascinating history. However, there is another story as well about how archaeologists discovered the civilization. When Harappan cities fell into ruin, people gradually forgot all about them. When men and women began living in the area millennia later, they did not know what to make of the strange artifacts that occasionally surfaced, washed by floods or exposed by soil erosion, or turned up while plowing a field, or digging for treasure. 10.1 Cunningham's confusion. When Cunningham, the first Director General of the ACI, began archaeological excavations in the mid-19th century, archaeologists preferred to use the written word, texts and inscriptions, as a guide to investigations. In fact, Cunningham's main interest was in the archaeology of the early historic, c. 6th century BCE, 4th century CE, and later periods. He used the accounts left by Chinese Buddhist pilgrims who had visited the subcontinent between the 4th and 7th centuries CE to locate early settlements. Cunningham also collected, documented, and translated inscriptions found during his surveys. When he excavated sites he tended to recover artifacts that he thought had cultural value. A site like Harappa, which was not part of the itinerary of the Chinese pilgrims and was not known as an early historic city, did not fit very neatly within his framework of investigation. So, although Harappan artifacts were found fairly often during the 19th century and some of these reached Cunningham, he did not realize how old these were. A Harappan seal was given to Cunningham by an Englishman. He noted the object, but unsuccessfully tried to place it within the time frame with which he was familiar. This was because he, like many others, thought that Indian history began with the first cities in the Ganga Valley. Given his specific focus, it is not surprising that he missed the significance of Harappa. 10.2 A new old civilization. Subsequently, seals were discovered at Harappa by archaeologists such as Daya Ramsani in the early decades of the 20th century, in layers that were definitely much older than early historic levels. It was then that their significance began to be realized. Another archaeologist, Rakul Das Banerjee, found similar seals at Mohenjo-daro, leading to the conjecture that these sites were part of a single archaeological culture. Based on these finds, in 1924, John Marshall, Director General of the ACI, announced the discovery of a new civilization in the Indus Valley to the world. As S.N. Roy noted in The story of Indian archaeology. Marshall left India 3,000 years older than he had found her. This was because similar, tilth and unidentified seals were found at excavations at Mesopotamian sites. It was then that the world knew not only of a new civilization, but also of one contemporaneous with Mesopotamia. In fact, John Marshall's stint as Director General of the ACI marked a major change in Indian archaeology. He was the first professional archaeologist to work in India, and brought his experience of working in Greece and Crete to the field. More importantly, though like Cunningham he too was interested in spectacular finds, he was equally keen to look for patterns of everyday life. Marshall tended to excavate along regular horizontal units, measured uniformly throughout the mound, ignoring the stratigraphy of the site. This meant that all the artifacts recovered from the same unit were grouped together, even if they were found at different stratigraphic layers. As a result, valuable information about the context of these finds was irretrievably lost. 10.3 EU Techniques and Questions. It was R.E.M. Wheeler, after he took over as Director General of the ACI in 1944, who rectified this problem. Wheeler recognized that it was necessary to follow the stratigraphy of the mound rather than dig mechanically along uniform horizontal lines. Moreover, as an ex-army brigadier, he brought with him a military precision to the practice of archaeology. The frontiers of the Harappan civilization have little or no connection with present-day national boundaries. However, with the partition of the subcontinent and the creation of Pakistan, the major sites are now in Pakistani territory. This has spurred Indian archaeologists to try and locate sites in India. An extensive survey in Kutch has revealed a number of Harappan settlements, and explorations in Punjab and Haryana have added to the list of Harappan sites. While Kalibangan, Lithal, Rakhigarai and most recently Dholavira have been discovered, explored, and excavated as part of these efforts, fresh explorations continue. Over the decades, new issues have assumed importance. Where some archaeologists are often keen to obtain a cultural sequence, others try to understand the logic underlying the location of specific sites. They also grapple with the wealth of artifacts, trying to figure out the functions these may have served. Since the 1980s, there has also been growing international interest in Harappan archaeology. Specialists from the subcontinent and abroad have been jointly working at both Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. They are using modern scientific techniques including surface exploration to recover traces of clay, stone, metal, and plant and animal remains, as well as to minutely analyze every scrap of available evidence. These explorations promise to yield interesting results in the future. 11. Problems of piecing together the past. As we have seen, it is not the Harappan script that helps in understanding the ancient civilization. Rather, it is material evidence that allows archaeologists to better reconstruct Harappan life. This material could be pottery, tools, ornaments, household objects, etc. Organic materials such as cloth, leather, wood, and reeds generally decompose, especially in tropical regions. What survive are stone, burnt clay, or terracotta, metal, etc. It is also important to remember that only broken or useless objects would have been thrown away. Other things would probably have been recycled. Consequently, valuable artifacts that are found intact were either lost in the past or hoarded and never retrieved. In other words, such finds are accidental rather than typical. 11.1 Classifying finds. Recovering artifacts is just the beginning of the archaeological enterprise. Archaeologists then classify their finds. One simple principle of classification is in terms of material, such as stone, clay, metal, bone, ivory, etc. The second, and more complicated, is in terms of function. Archaeologists have to decide whether, for instance, an artifact is a tool or an ornament, or both, or something meant for ritual use. An understanding of the function of an artifact is often shaped by its resemblance with present-day things. Beads, querns, stone blades, and pots are obvious examples. Archaeologists also try to identify the function of an artifact by investigating the context in which it was found. Was it found in a house, in a drain, in a grave, in a kill? Sometimes, archaeologists have to take recourse to indirect evidence. For instance, though there are traces of cotton at some Harappan sites, to find out about clothing we have to depend on indirect evidence including depictions in sculpture. Archaeologists have to develop frames of reference. We have seen that the first Harappan seal that was found could not be understood till archaeologists had a context in which to place it, both in terms of the cultural sequence in which it was found, and in terms of a comparison with finds in Mesopotamia. 11.2 Problems of Interpretation. The problems of archaeological interpretation are perhaps most evident in attempts to reconstruct religious practices. Early archaeologists thought that certain objects which seemed unusual or unfamiliar may have had a religious significance. These included terracotta figurines of women, heavily jeweled, some with elaborate headdresses. These were regarded as mother goddesses. Rare stone statuary of men in an almost standardized posture, seated with one hand on the knee, such as the priest-king, was also similarly classified. In other instances, structures have been assigned ritual significance. These include the great bath and fire altars found at Kalabangan and Lithal. Attempts have also been made to reconstruct religious beliefs and practices by examining seals, some of which seem to depict ritual scenes. Others, with plant motifs, are thought to indicate nature worship. Some animals, such as the one-horned animal, often called the unicorn depicted on seals, seem to be mythical, composite creatures. In some seals, a figure shown seated cross-legged in a yogic posture, sometimes surrounded by animals, has been regarded as a depiction of Proto-Shiva, that is, an early form of one of the major deities of Hinduism. Besides, conical stone objects have been classified as lingas. Many reconstructions of Harappan religion are made on the assumption that later traditions provide parallels with earlier ones. This is because archaeologists often move from the known to the unknown, that is, from the present to the past. While this is plausible in the case of stone querns and pots, it becomes more speculative when we extend it to religious symbols. Let us look, for instance, at the Proto-Shiva seals. The earliest religious text, the Rigveda, compiled c. 1500 to 1000 BCE, mentions a god named Rudra, which is a name used for Shiva in later Puranic traditions, in the first millennium CE, see also chapter 4. However, unlike Shiva, Rudra in the Rigveda is neither depicted as Pashupati, lord of animals in general and cattle in particular, nor as a yogi. In other words, this depiction does not match the description of Rudra in the Rigveda. Is this, then, possibly a shaman, as some scholars have suggested? What has been achieved after so many decades of archaeological work? We have a fairly good idea of the Harappan economy. We have been able to tease out social differences, and we have some idea of how the civilization functioned. It is really not clear how much more we would know if the script were to be deciphered. If a bilingual inscription is found, questions about the languages spoken by the Harappans could perhaps be put to rest. Several reconstructions remain speculative at present. Was the Great Bath a ritual structure? How widespread was literacy? Why do Harappan cemeteries show little social differentiation? Also unanswered are questions on gender. Did women make pottery, or did they only paint pots, as at present? What about other craftspersons? What were the terracotta female figurines used for? Very few scholars have investigated issues of gender in the context of the Harappan civilization, and this is a whole new area for future work. Timeline 1. Major periods in early Indian archaeology. 2 million BP Lower Paleolithic. Before present. 80,000 BP Middle Paleolithic. 35,000 BP Upper Paleolithic. 12,000 BP Mesolithic. 10,000 BP Neolithic, early agriculturists and pastoralists. 6,000 BP Chalcolithic, first use of copper. 2600 BCE Harappan civilization. 1000 BCE early iron, megalithic burials. 600 BCE to 400 CE early historic. Timeline 2. Major developments in Harappan archaeology. In 10th century. 1875 Report of Alexander Cunningham on Harappan seal. 20th century. 1921 MS. Vats begins excavations at Harappa. 1925 Excavations begin at Mohenjo-daro. 1946 REM. Wheeler excavates at Harappa. 1955 SR. Rao begins excavations at Lothal. 1960 BB. Lal and BK. Thapar begin excavations at Kalabangan. 1974 MR. Mughal begins explorations in Bahawalpur. 1980 A team of German and Italian archaeologists begins surface explorations at Mohenjo-daro. 1986 American team begins excavations at Harappa. 1990 RS. Bisht begins excavations at Dholavira. Source 1. How artifacts are identified. Processing of food required grinding equipment as well as vessels for mixing, blending and cooking. These were made of stone, metal, and terracotta. This is an excerpt from one of the earliest reports on excavations at Mohenjo-daro, the best-known Harappan site. Saddle querns are found in considerable numbers, and they seem to have been the only means in use for grinding cereals. As a rule, they were roughly made of hard, gritty, igneous rock or sandstone and mostly show signs of hard usage. As their bases are usually convex, they must have been set in the earth or in mud to prevent their rocking. Two main types have been found, those on which another smaller stone was pushed or rolled to and fro, and others with which a second stone was used as a pounder, eventually making a large cavity in the nether stone. Querns of the former type were probably used solely for grain, the second type possibly only for pounding herbs and spices for making curries. In fact, stones of this latter type are dubbed curry stones by our workmen, and our cook asked for the loan of one from the museum for use in the kitchen. From Ernest Mackay, Further Excavations at Mohenjo-daro, 1937. Source 2. The most ancient system yet discovered. About the drains, Mackay noted, it is certainly the most complete ancient system as yet discovered. Every house was connected to the street drains. The main channels were made of bricks set in mortar and were covered with loose bricks that could be removed for cleaning. In some cases, limestone was used for the covers. House drains first emptied into a sump or cesspit into which solid matter settled while waste water flowed out into the street drains. Very long drainage channels were provided at intervals with sumps for cleaning. It is a wonder of archaeology that little heaps of material, mostly sand, have frequently been found lying alongside drainage channels, which shows that the debris was not always carted away when the drain was cleared. From Ernest Mackay, Early Indus Civilization, 1948. Drainage systems were not unique to the larger cities, but were found in smaller settlements as well. At Lothal, for example, while houses were built of mud bricks, drains were made of burnt bricks. Hoards are objects kept carefully by people, often inside containers such as pots. Such hoards can be of jewelry or metal objects saved for reuse by metal workers. If for some reason the original owners do not retrieve them, they remain where they are left till some archaeologist finds them. Source 3. Evidence of an invasion. Dead Man Lane is a narrow alley, varying from 3 to 6 feet in width. At the point where the lane turns westward, part of a skull and the bones of the thorax and upper arm of an adult were discovered, all in very friable condition, at a depth of 4 feet 2 inches. The body lay on its back diagonally across the lane. 15 inches to the west were a few fragments of a tiny skull. It is to these remains that the lane owes its name. From John Marshall, Mohenjo-daro and the Indus Civilization, 1931. 16 skeletons of people with the ornaments that they were wearing when they died were found from the same part of Mohenjo-daro in 1925. Much later, in 1947, REM. Wheeler, then Director General of the ACI, tried to correlate this archaeological evidence with that of the Rigveda, the earliest known text in the subcontinent. He wrote, "The Rigveda mentions Pur, meaning rampart, fort or stronghold. Indra, the Aryan war god, is called Paramdara, the fort destroyer. Where are or were these citadels? It has in the past been supposed that they were mythical. Recent excavation of Harappa may be thought to have changed the picture. Here we have a highly evolved civilization of essentially Nonarian type, now known to have employed massive fortifications. What destroyed this firmly settled civilization? Climatic, economic, or political deterioration may have weakened it, but its ultimate extinction is more likely to have been completed by deliberate and large-scale destruction. It may be no mere chance that at a late period of Mohenjo-daro men, women, and children appear to have been massacred there. On circumstantial evidence, Indra stands accused. From Rem. Wheeler, Harappa 1946, Ancient India, 1947. In the 1960s, the evidence of a massacre in Mohenjo-daro was questioned by an archaeologist named George Dales. He demonstrated that the skeletons found at the site did not belong to the same period. Whereas a couple of them definitely seem to indicate a slaughter, the bulk of the bones were found in contexts suggesting burials of the sloppiest and most irreverent nature. There is no destruction level covering the latest period of the city, no sign of extensive burning, no bodies of warriors clad in armor and surrounded by the weapons of war. The citadel, the only fortified part of the city, yielded no evidence of a final defense. From G.F. Dales, The Mythical Massacre at Mohenjo-daro, expeded in 1964. Sites, mounds, layers. Archaeological sites are formed through the production, use, and discarding of materials and structures. When people continue to live in the same place, their constant use and reuse of the landscape results in the buildup of occupational debris, called a mound. Brief or permanent abandonment results in alteration of the landscape by wind or water activity and erosion. Occupations are detected by traces of ancient materials found in layers, which differ from one another in color, texture, and the artifacts that are found in them. Abandonment or desertions, what are called sterile layers, can be identified by the absence of such traces. Generally, the lowest layers are the oldest and the highest are the most recent. The study of these layers is called stratigraphy. Artifacts found in layers can be assigned to specific cultural periods and can thus provide the cultural sequence for a site. Wheeler at Harappa. Early archaeologists were often driven by a sense of adventure. This is what Wheeler wrote about his experience at Harappa. It was, I recall, on a warm May night in 1944 that a 4 miles Tonga ride brought me as the newly appointed Director General of the Archaeological Survey with my local Muslim officer from a little railway station labeled Harappa along a deep sand track to a small rest house beside the moonlit mounds of the ancient site. Warned by my anxious colleague that we must start our inspection at 5:30 next morning and finish by 7:30 after which it would be too hot, we turned in with the dark figure of the Punkawala crouched patiently in the entrance and the night air rent by innumerable jackals in the neighboring wilderness. Next morning, punctually at 5:30, our little procession started out towards the sandy heaps. Within 10 minutes I stopped and rubbed my eyes as I gazed upon the tallest mound, scarcely trusting my vision. 6 hours later my embarrassed staff and I were still toiling with picks and knives under the blazing sun, the Mad Sahib, I am afraid, setting a relentless pace. From Rem. Wheeler. My Archaeological Mission to India and Pakistan, 1976. Shamans are men and women who claim magical and healing powers, as well as an ability to communicate with the other world. The plight of Harappa. Although Harappa was the first site to be discovered, it was badly destroyed by brick robbers. As early as 1875, Alexander Cunningham, the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, ACI, often called the father of Indian archaeology, noted that the amount of brick taken from the ancient site was enough to lay bricks for about 100 miles of the railway line between Lahore and Multan. Thus, many of the ancient structures at the site were damaged. In contrast, Mohenjo-daro was far better preserved. Citadels. While most Harappan settlements have a small high western part and a larger lower eastern section, there are variations. At sites such as Dholavira and Lithal, Gujarat, the entire settlement was fortified, and sections within the town were also separated by walls. The citadel within Lithal was not walled off, but was built at a height. Theme: kings, farmers, and towns. 2 Early states and economies. c. 600 BCE to 600 CE. There were several developments in different parts of the subcontinent during the long span of 1,500 years following the end of the Harappan civilization. This was also the period during which the Rigveda was composed by people living along the Indus and its tributaries. Agricultural settlements emerged in many parts of the subcontinent, including North India, the Deccan Plateau, and parts of Karnataka. Besides, there is evidence of pastoral populations in the Deccan and further south. New modes of disposal of the dead, including the making of elaborate stone structures known as megaliths, emerged in central and south India from the 1st millennium BCE. In many cases, the dead were buried with a rich range of iron tools and weapons. From c. 6th century BCE, there is evidence that there were other trends as well. Perhaps the most visible was the emergence of early states, empires, and kingdoms. Underlying these political processes were other changes, evident in the ways in which agricultural production was organized. Simultaneously, new towns appeared almost throughout the subcontinent. Historians attempt to understand these developments by drawing on a range of sources: inscriptions, texts, coins, and visual material. As we will see, this is a complex process. You will also notice that these sources do not tell the entire story. Princeps and Piyadasi. Some of the most momentous developments in Indian epigraphy took place in the 1830s. This was when James Princeps, an officer in the Mint of the East India Company, deciphered Brahmi and Kharosthi, 2 scripts used in the earliest inscriptions and coins. He found that most of these mentioned a king referred to as Piyadasi, meaning pleasant to behold. There were a few inscriptions which also referred to the king as Asoka, one of the most famous rulers known from Buddhist texts. This gave a new direction to investigations into early Indian political history, as European and Indian scholars used inscriptions and texts composed in a variety of languages to reconstruct the lineages of major dynasties that had ruled the subcontinent. As a result, the broad contours of political history were in place by the early decades of the 20th century. Subsequently, scholars began to shift their focus to the context of political history, investigating whether there were connections between political changes and economic and social developments. It was soon realized that while there were links, these were not always simple or direct. 2. The earliest states. 2.1 The 16 Mahajanapadas. The 6th century BCE is often regarded as a major turning point in early Indian history. It is an era associated with early states, cities, the growing use of iron, the development of coinage, etc. It also witnessed the growth of diverse systems of thought, including Buddhism and Jainism. Early Buddhist and Jaina texts mention, amongst other things, 16 states known as Mahajanapadas. Although the lists vary, some names such as Vaji, Magadha, Koshala, Kuru, Panchala, Gandhara, and Avanti occur frequently. Clearly, these were amongst the most important Mahajanapadas. While most Mahajanapadas were ruled by kings, some, known as Ganas or Sungas, were oligarchies, where power was shared by a number of men, often collectively called Rajas. Both Mahavira and the Buddha belonged to such Ganas. In some instances, as in the case of the Vaji Sangha, the Rajas probably controlled resources such as land collectively. Although their histories are often difficult to reconstruct due to the lack of sources, some of these states lasted for nearly 1,000 years. Each Mahajanapada had a capital city, which was often fortified. Maintaining these fortified cities as well as providing for incipient armies and bureaucracies required resources. From c. 6th century BCE onwards, Brahmanas began composing Sanskrit texts known as the Dharma Sutras. These laid down norms for rulers, as well as for other social categories, who were ideally expected to be Kshatriyas. Rulers were advised to collect taxes and tribute from cultivators, traders, and artisans. Were resources also procured from pastoralists and forest peoples? We do not really know. What we do know is that raids on neighboring states were recognized as a legitimate means of acquiring wealth. Gradually, some states acquired standing armies and maintained regular bureaucracies. Others continued to depend on militia, recruited, more often than not, from the peasantry. 2.2 First amongst the 16, Magadha. Between the 6th and the 4th centuries BCE, Magadha, in present-day Bihar, became the most powerful Mahajanapada. Modern historians explain this development in a variety of ways. Magadha was a region where agriculture was especially productive. Besides, iron mines, in present-day Jharkhand, were accessible and provided resources for tools and weapons. Elephants, an important component of the army, were found in forests in the region. Also, the Ganga and its tributaries provided a means of cheap and convenient communication. However, early Buddhist and Jaina writers who wrote about Magadha attributed its power to the policies of individuals, ruthlessly ambitious kings of whom Bimbisara, Ajatasattu, and Mahapadmananda are the best known, and their ministers, who helped implement their policies. Initially, Rajagaha, the Prakrit name for present-day Rajgarh in Bihar, was the capital of Magadha. Interestingly, the old name means House of the King. Rajagaha was a fortified settlement, located amongst hills. Later, in the 4th century BCE, the capital was shifted to Pataliputra, present-day Putna, commanding routes of communication along the Ganga. 3. An early empire. The growth of Magadha culminated in the emergence of the Mauryan Empire. Chandragupta Maurya, who founded the empire, c. 321 BCE, extended control as far northwest as Afghanistan and Baluchistan, and his grandson Asoka, arguably the most famous ruler of early India, conquered Kalinga, present-day coastal Orissa. 3.1 Finding out about the Mauryas. Historians have used a variety of sources to reconstruct the history of the Mauryan Empire. These include archaeological finds, especially sculpture. Also valuable are contemporary works, such as the account of Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador to the court of Chandragupta Maurya, which survives in fragments. Another source that is often used is the Arthashastra, parts of which were probably composed by Kautilya or Chanakya, traditionally believed to be the minister of Chandragupta. Besides, the Mauryas are mentioned in later Buddhist, Jaina, and Puranic literature, as well as in Sanskrit literary works. While these are useful, the inscriptions of Asoka, c. 272–268 to 231 BCE, on rocks and pillars are often regarded as amongst the most valuable sources. Asoka was the first ruler who inscribed his messages to his subjects and officials on stone surfaces, natural rocks as well as polished pillars. He used the inscriptions to proclaim what he understood to be Dhamma. This included respect towards elders, generosity towards brahmanas and those who renounced worldly life, treating slaves and servants kindly, and respect for religions and traditions other than one's own. 3.2 Administering the empire. There were 5 major political centers in the empire: the capital Pataliputra and the provincial centers of Taxila, Ujjayini, Tosali, and Suvarnagiri, all mentioned in Asokan inscriptions. If we examine the content of these inscriptions, we find virtually the same message engraved everywhere. From the present-day northwest frontier provinces of Pakistan, to Andhra Pradesh, Orissa and Uttaranchal in India. Could this vast empire have had a uniform administrative system? Historians have increasingly come to realize that this is unlikely. The regions included within the empire were just too diverse. Imagine the contrast between the hilly terrain of Afghanistan and the coast of Orissa. It is likely that administrative control was strongest in areas around the capital and the provincial centers. These centers were carefully chosen, both Taxila and Ujjayini being situated on important long-distance trade routes, while Suvarnagiri, literally, the Golden Mountain, was possibly important for tapping the gold mines of Karnataka. Communication along both land and riverine routes was vital for the existence of the empire. Journeys. From the center to the provinces could have taken weeks if not months. This meant arranging for provisions as well as protection for those who were on the move. It is obvious that the army was an important means for ensuring the latter. Megasthens mentions a committee with 6 subcommittees for coordinating military activity. Of these, one looked after the navy, the second managed transport and provisions, the third was responsible for foot soldiers, the fourth for horses, the fifth for chariots and the sixth for elephants. The activities of the second subcommittee were rather varied, arranging for bullock carts to carry equipment, procuring food for soldiers and fodder for animals, and recruiting servants and artisans to look after the soldiers. Asoka also tried to hold his empire together by propagating Dhamma, the principles of which, as we have seen, were simple and virtually universally applicable. This, according to him, would ensure the well-being of people in this world and the next. Special officers, known as the Dhamma Mahamata, were appointed to spread the message of Dhamma. 3.3 How important was the empire? When historians began reconstructing early Indian history in the 19th century, the emergence of the Mauryan Empire was regarded as a major landmark. India was then under colonial rule, and was part of the British Empire. 19th and early 20th century Indian historians found the possibility that there was an empire in early India both challenging and exciting. Also, some of the archaeological finds associated with the Mauryas, including stone sculpture, were considered to be examples of the spectacular art typical of empires. Many of these historians found the message on Asokan inscriptions very different from that of most other rulers, suggesting that Asoka was more powerful and industrious, as also more humble than later rulers who adopted grandiose titles. So it is not surprising that nationalist leaders in the 20th century regarded him as an inspiring figure. Yet, how important was the Mauryan Empire? It lasted for about 150 years, which is not a very long time in the vast span of the history of the subcontinent. Besides, if you look at Map 2, you will notice that the empire did not encompass the entire subcontinent. And even within the frontiers of the empire, control was not uniform. By the 2nd century BCE, new chiefdoms and kingdoms emerged in several parts of the subcontinent. 4. New notions of kingship. 4.1 Chiefs and kings in the south. The new kingdoms that emerged in the Deccan and further south, including the chiefdoms of the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas in Tamilakam, the name of the ancient Tamil country, which included parts of present-day Andhra Pradesh and Kerala, in addition to Tamil Nadu, proved to be stable and prosperous. We know about these states from a variety of sources. For instance, the early Tamil Sangam texts contain poems describing chiefs and the ways in which they acquired and distributed resources. Many chiefs and kings, including the Satavahanas who ruled over parts of western and central India, c. 2nd century BC, 2nd century CE, and the Shakas, a people of Central Asian origin who established kingdoms in the northwestern and western parts of the subcontinent, derived revenues from long-distance trade. Their social origins were often obscure, but, as we will see in the case of the Satavahanas, once they acquired power they attempted to claim social status in a variety of ways. 4.2 Divine Kings. One means of claiming high status was to identify with a variety of deities. This strategy is best exemplified by the Kushanas, c. 1st century BCE 1st century CE, who ruled over a vast kingdom extending from Central Asia to northwest India. Their history has been reconstructed from inscriptions and textual traditions. The notions of kingship they wished to project are perhaps best evidenced in their coins and sculpture. Colossal statues of Kushana rulers have been found installed in a shrine at Mat near Mathura, Uttar Pradesh. Similar statues have been found in a shrine in Afghanistan as well. Some historians feel this indicates that the Kushanas considered themselves godlike. Many Kushana rulers also adopted the title Devaputra, or Son of God, possibly inspired by Chinese rulers who called themselves Sons of Heaven. By the 4th century there is evidence of larger states, including the Gupta Empire. Many of these depended on Samantas, men who maintained themselves through local resources including control over land. They offered homage and provided military support to rulers. Powerful Samantas could become kings. Conversely, weak rulers might find themselves being reduced to positions of subordination. Histories of the Gupta rulers have been reconstructed from literature, coins and inscriptions, including Prashastas, composed in praise of kings in particular, and patrons in general, by poets. While historians often attempt to draw factual information from such compositions, those who composed and read them often treasured them as works of poetry rather than as accounts that were literally true. The Prayaga Prashasti, also known as the Allahabad Pillar inscription, composed in Sanskrit by Harishina, the court poet of Samudragupta, arguably the most powerful of the Gupta rulers, c. 4th century CE, is a case in point. 5. A changing countryside. 5.1 Popular perceptions of kings. What did subjects think about their rulers? Obviously, inscriptions do not provide all the answers. In fact, ordinary people rarely left accounts of their thoughts and experiences. Nevertheless, historians have tried to solve this problem by examining stories contained in anthologies such as the Jatakas and the Panchatantra. Many of these stories probably originated as popular oral tales that were later committed to writing. The Jatakas were written in Pali around the middle of the first millennium CE. One story known as the Gonde Tindu Jataka describes the plight of the subjects of a wicked king. These included elderly women and men, cultivators, herders, village boys, and even animals. When the king went in disguise to find out what his subjects thought about him, each one of them cursed him for their miseries, complaining that they were attacked by robbers at night and by tax collectors during the day. To escape from this situation, people abandoned their village and went to live in the forest. As this story indicates, the relationship between a king and his subjects, especially the rural population, could often be strained. Kings frequently tried to fill their coffers by demanding high taxes, and peasants particularly found such demands oppressive. Escaping into the forest remained an option, as reflected in the Jataka story. Meanwhile, other strategies aimed at increasing production to meet growing demand for taxes also came to be adopted. 5.2 Strategies for increasing production. One such strategy was the shift to plough agriculture, which spread in fertile alluvial river valleys such as those of the Ganga and the Kaveri from c. 6th century BCE. The iron-tipped plowshare was used to turn the alluvial soil in areas which had high rainfall. Moreover, in some parts of the Ganga Valley, production of paddy was dramatically increased by the introduction of transplantation, although this meant back-breaking work for the producer. While the iron plowshare led to a growth in agricultural productivity, its use was restricted to certain parts of the subcontinent. Cultivators in areas which were semi-arid, such as parts of Punjab and Rajasthan, did not adopt it till the 20th century, and those living in hilly tracts in the northeastern and central parts of the subcontinent practiced hoe agriculture, which was much better suited to the terrain. Another strategy adopted to increase agricultural production was the use of irrigation through wells and tanks, and less commonly, canals. Communities as well as individuals organized the construction of irrigation works. The latter, usually powerful men including kings, often recorded such activities in inscriptions. 5.3 Differences in rural society. While these technologies often led to an increase in production, the benefits were very uneven. What is evident is that there was a growing differentiation amongst people engaged in agriculture. Stories, especially within the Buddhist tradition, refer to landless agricultural laborers, small peasants, as well as large landholders. The term Gahapati was often used in Pali texts to designate the second and third categories. The large landholders, as well as the village headmen, whose position was often hereditary, emerged as powerful figures, and often exercised control over other cultivators. Early Tamil literature, the Sangam texts, also mentions different categories of people living in the villages: large landowners or vellalar, ploughmen, or uzavar, and slaves or adamai. It is likely that these differences were based on differential access to land, labor and some of the new technologies. In such a situation, questions of control over land must have become crucial, as these were often discussed in legal texts. 5.4 Land grants and new rural elites. From the early centuries of the Common Era, we find grants of land being made, many of which were recorded in inscriptions. Some of these inscriptions were on stone, but most were on copper plates, which were probably given as a record of the transaction to those who received the land. The records that have survived are generally about grants to religious institutions or to brahmanas. Most inscriptions were in Sanskrit. In some cases, and especially from the 7th century onwards, part of the inscription was in Sanskrit, while the rest was in a local language such as Tamil or Telugu. Let us look at one such inscription more closely. Prabhavati Gupta was the daughter of one of the most important rulers in early Indian history, Chandragupta II, c. 375 to 415 CE. She was married into another important ruling family, that of the Vakatakas, who were powerful in the Deccan. According to Sanskrit legal texts, women were not supposed to have independent access to resources such as land. However, the inscription indicates that Prabhavati had access to land, which she then granted. This may have been because she was a queen, one of the few known from early Indian history, and her situation was therefore exceptional. It is also possible that the provisions of legal texts were not uniformly implemented. The inscription also gives us an idea about rural populations. These included brahmanas and peasants, as well as others who were expected to provide a range of produce to the king or his representatives. And, according to the inscription, they would have to obey the new lord of the village, and perhaps pay him all these dues. Land grants such as this one have been found in several parts of the country. There were regional variations in the sizes of land donated, ranging from small plots to vast stretches of uncultivated land, and the rights given to donees, the recipients of the grant. The impact of land grants is a subject of heated debate among historians. Some feel that land grants were part of a strategy adopted by ruling lineages to extend agriculture to new areas. Others suggest that land grants were indicative of weakening political power. As kings were losing control over their samantas, they tried to win allies by making grants of land. They also feel that kings tried to project themselves as supermen, as we saw in the previous section. Because they were losing control, they wanted to present at least a facade of power. Land grants provide some insight into the relationship between cultivators and the state. However, there were people who were often beyond the reach of officials or samantas, pastoralists, fisherfolk, and hunter-gatherers, mobile or semi-sedentary artisans and shifting cultivators. Generally, such groups did not keep detailed records of their lives and transactions. 6. Towns and trade. 6.1 U cities. Let us retrace our steps back to the urban centers that emerged in several parts of the subcontinent from c. 6th century BCE. As we have seen, many of these were capitals of Mahajanapadas. Virtually all major towns were located along routes of communication. Some, such as Pataliputra, were on riverine routes. Others, such as Ujjayani, were along land routes, and yet others, such as Pohar, were near the coast, from where sea routes began. Many cities like Mathura were bustling centers of commercial, cultural, and political activity. 6.2 Urban populations, elites and craftspersons. We have seen that kings and ruling elites lived in fortified cities. Although it is difficult to conduct extensive excavations at most sites because people live in these areas even today, unlike the Harappan cities, a wide range of artifacts have been recovered from them. These include fine pottery bowls and dishes, with a glossy finish, known as northern black polished ware, probably used by rich people, and ornaments, tools, weapons, vessels, figurines, made of a wide range of materials: gold, silver, copper, bronze, ivory, glass, shell, and terracotta. By the 2nd century BCE, we find short votive inscriptions in a number of cities. These mention the name of the donor, and sometimes specify his/her occupation as well. They tell us about people who lived in towns: washing folk, weavers, scribes, carpenters, potters, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, officials, religious teachers, merchants and kings. Sometimes, guilds or shrinas, organizations of craft producers and merchants, are mentioned as well. These guilds probably procured raw materials, regulated production, and marketed the finished product. It is likely that craftspersons used a range of iron tools to meet the growing demands of urban elites. 6.3 Trade in the subcontinent and beyond. From the 6th century BCE, land and river routes crisscrossed the subcontinent and extended in various directions overland into Central Asia and beyond, and overseas, from ports that dotted the coastline extending across the Arabian Sea to East and North Africa and West Asia, and through the Bay of Bengal to Southeast Asia and China. Rulers often attempted to control these routes, possibly by offering protection for a price. Those who traversed these routes included peddlers who probably traveled on foot and merchants who traveled with caravans of bullock carts and pack animals. Also, there were seafarers, whose ventures were risky but highly profitable. Successful merchants, designated as Masatovan in Tamil and Sethis and Sathavahas in Prakrit, could become enormously rich. A wide range of goods were carried from one place to another: salt, grain, cloth, metal ores, and finished products, stone, timber, medicinal plants, to name a few. Spices, especially pepper, were in high demand in the Roman Empire, as were textiles and medicinal plants, and these were all transported across the Arabian Sea to the Mediterranean. 6.4 Coins and kings. To some extent, exchanges were facilitated by the introduction of coinage. Punch-marked coins made of silver and copper, c. 6th century BCE onwards, were amongst the earliest to be minted and used. These have been recovered from excavations at a number of sites throughout the subcontinent. Numismatists have studied these and other coins to reconstruct possible commercial networks. Attempts made to identify the symbols on punch-marked coins with specific ruling dynasties, including the Mauryas, suggest that these were issued by kings. It is also likely that merchants, bankers, and townspeople issued some of these coins. The first coins to bear the names and images of rulers were issued by the Indo-Greeks, who established control over the northwestern part of the subcontinent c. 2nd century BCE. The first gold coins were issued c. 1st century CE by the Kushanas. These were virtually identical in weight with those issued by contemporary Roman emperors and the Parthian rulers of Iran, and have been found from several sites in North India and Central Asia. The widespread use of gold coins indicates the enormous value of the transactions that were taking place. Besides, hoards of Roman coins have been found from archaeological sites in South India. It is obvious that networks of trade were not confined within political boundaries. South India was not part of the Roman Empire, but there were close connections through trade. Coins were also issued by tribal republics such as that of the Yodhiyas of Punjab and Haryana, c. 1st century CE. Archaeologists have unearthed several thousand copper coins issued by the Yodhiyas, pointing to the latter's interest and participation in economic exchanges. Some of the most spectacular gold coins were issued by the Gupta rulers. The earliest issues are remarkable for their purity. These coins facilitated long-distance transactions from which kings also benefited. From c. 6th century CE onwards, finds of gold coins taper off. Does this indicate that there was some kind of an economic crisis? Historians are divided on this issue. Some suggest that with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, long-distance trade declined, and this affected the prosperity of the states, communities, and regions that had benefited from it. Others argue that new towns and networks of trade started emerging around this time. They also point out that though finds of coins of that time are fewer, coins continue to be mentioned in inscriptions and texts. Could it be that there are fewer finds because coins were in circulation rather than being hoarded? 7. Back to basics. How are inscriptions deciphered? So far, we have been studying excerpts from inscriptions amongst other things. But how do historians find out what is written on them? 7.1 Deciphering Brahmi. Most scripts used to write modern Indian languages are derived from Brahmi, the script used in most Asokan inscriptions. From the late 18th century, European scholars aided by Indian Pandits worked backwards from contemporary Bengali and Devanagari, the script used to write Hindi, manuscripts, comparing their letters with older specimens. Scholars who studied early inscriptions sometimes assumed these were in Sanskrit, although the earliest inscriptions were, in fact, in Prakrit. It was only after decades of painstaking investigations by several epigraphists that James Prinsep was able to decipher Azokan Brahmi in 1838. 7.2 How Kharosthi was read. The story of the decipherment of Kharosthi, the script used in inscriptions in the northwest, is different. Here, finds of coins of Indo-Greek kings who ruled over the area, c. 2nd–1st centuries BCE, have facilitated matters. These coins contain the names of kings written in Greek and Kharosthi scripts. European scholars who could read the former compared the letters. For instance, the symbol for A could be found in both scripts for writing names such as Apollodotus. With Prinsep identifying the language of the Kharosthi inscriptions as Prakrit, it became possible to read longer inscriptions as well. 7.3 Historical evidence from inscriptions. To find out how epigraphists and historians work, let us look at two Azokan inscriptions more closely. Note that the name of the ruler, Asoka, is not mentioned in the inscription. What is used instead are titles adopted by the ruler Devanampiya, often translated as beloved of the gods and Piyadasi, or pleasant to behold. The name Asoka is mentioned in some other inscriptions, which also contain these titles. After examining all these inscriptions, and finding that they match in terms of content, style, language, and paleography, epigraphists have concluded that they were issued by the same ruler. You may also have noticed that Asoka claims that earlier rulers had no arrangements to receive reports. If you consider the political history of the subcontinent prior to Asoka, do you think this statement is true? Historians have to constantly assess statements made in inscriptions to judge whether they are true, plausible or exaggerations. Did you notice that there are words within brackets? Epigraphists sometimes add these to make the meaning of sentences clear. This has to be done carefully, to ensure that the intended meaning of the author is not changed. Historians have to make other assessments as well. If a king's orders were inscribed on natural rocks near cities or important routes of communication, would passers-by have stopped to read these? Most people were probably not literate. Did everybody throughout the subcontinent understand the Prakrit used in Pataliputra? Would the orders of the king have been followed? Answers to such questions are not always easy to find. Some of these problems are evident if we look at an Azokan inscription, which has often been interpreted as reflecting the anguish of the ruler, as well as marking a change in his attitude towards warfare. As we shall see, the situation becomes more complex once we move beyond reading the inscription at face value. While Azokan inscriptions have been found in present-day Orissa, the one depicting his anguish is missing. In other words, the inscription has not been found in the region that was conquered. What are we to make of that? Is it that the anguish of the recent conquest was too painful in the region, and therefore the ruler was unable to address the issue? 8. The limitations of inscriptional evidence. By now it is probably evident that there are limits to what epigraphy can reveal. Sometimes, there are technical limitations, letters are very faintly engraved, and thus reconstructions are uncertain. Also, inscriptions may be damaged or letters missing. Besides, it is not always easy to be sure about the exact meaning of the words used in inscriptions, some of which may be specific to a particular place or time. If you go through an epigraphical journal, some are listed in timeline too, you will realize that scholars are constantly debating and discussing alternative ways of reading inscriptions. Although several thousand inscriptions have been discovered, not all have been deciphered, published, and translated. Besides, many more inscriptions must have existed, which have not survived the ravages of time. So what is available at present is probably only a fraction of what was inscribed. There is another, perhaps more fundamental, problem. Not everything that we may consider politically or economically significant was necessarily recorded in inscriptions. For instance, routine agricultural practices and the joys and sorrows of daily existence find no mention in inscriptions, which focus, more often than not, on grand, unique events. Besides, the content of inscriptions almost invariably projects the perspective of the person, who commissioned them. As such, they need to be juxtaposed with other perspectives so as to arrive at a better understanding of the past. Thus epigraphy alone does not provide a full understanding of political and economic history. Also, historians often question both old and new evidence. Scholars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were primarily interested in the histories of kings. From the mid-20th century onwards, issues such as economic change, and the ways in which different social groups emerged have assumed far more importance. Recent decades have seen a much greater preoccupation with histories of marginalist groups. This will probably lead to fresh investigations of old sources, and the development of new strategies of analysis. Timeline 1. Major political and economic developments. c. 600 to 500 BCE paddy transplantation, urbanization in the Ganga Valley, Mahajanapadas, punch to marked coins. c. 500 to 400 BCE rulers of Magadha consolidate power. c. 327 to 325 BCE invasion of Alexander of Macedon. c. 321 BCE accession of Chandragupta Maurya. c. 272/268 to 231 BCE reign of Asoka. c. 185 BCE end of the Mauryan Empire. c. 200 to 100 BCE Indo to Greek rule in the northwest, Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas in South India, Satavahanas in the Deccan. c. 100 BCE to 200 CE Shaka, peoples from Central Asia, rulers in the northwest, Roman trade, gold coinage. c. 78 CE accession of Kanishka. c. 100 to 200 CE earliest inscriptional evidence of land grants by Satavahana and Shaka rulers. c. 320 CE beginning of Gupta rule. c. 335 to 375 CE Samudragupta. c. 375 to 415 CE Chandragupta II, Vakatakas in the Deccan. c. 500 to 600 CE rise of the Chalukyas in Karnataka and of the Pallavas in Tamil Nadu. c. 606 to 647 CE Harshavardhana king of Kanawai, Chinese pilgrim. Xuanzang comes in search of Buddhist texts. c. 712 Arabs conquer Sind. Timeline 2. Major advances in epigraphy. 18th century. 1784. 19th century. 1810s. 1838. 1877. 1886. 1888. Founding of the Asiatic Society, Bengal. Colin Mackenzie collects over 8,000 inscriptions in Sanskrit and Dravidian languages. Decipherment of Azokan Brahmi by James Prinsep. Alexander Cunningham publishes a set of Azokan inscriptions. First issue of Epigraphia Carnatica, a journal of South Indian inscriptions. First issue of Epigraphia Indica. 20th century. 1965 to 66. D.C. Sarkar publishes Indian epigraphy and Indian epigraphical glossary. Epigraphy is the study of inscriptions. Inscriptions. Inscriptions are writings engraved on hard surfaces such as stone, metal, or pottery. They usually record the achievements, activities, or ideas of those who commissioned them and include the exploits of kings, or donations made by women and men to religious institutions. Inscriptions are virtually permanent records, some of which carry dates. Others are dated on the basis of paleography or styles of writing, with a fair amount of precision. For instance, in c. 250 BCE the letter A was written like this. By c. 500 CE, it was written like this. The earliest inscriptions were in Prakrit, a name for languages used by ordinary people. Names of rulers such as Ajatasattu and Asoka, known from Prakrit texts and inscriptions, have been spelt in their Prakrit forms in this chapter. You will also find terms in languages such as Pali, Tamil, and Sanskrit, which too were used to write inscriptions and texts. It is possible that people spoke in other languages as well, even though these were not used for writing. Janapada, meaning the land where a jana, a people, clan, or tribe, sets its foot or settles. It is a word used in both Prakrit and Sanskrit. Oligarchy refers to a form of government where power is exercised by a group of men. The Roman Republic, about which you read last year, was an oligarchy in spite of its name. Transplantation is used for paddy cultivation in areas where water is plentiful. Here, seeds are first broadcast. When the saplings have grown, they are transplanted in waterlogged fields. This ensures a higher ratio of survival of saplings and higher yields. An agrahara was land granted to a brahmana, who was usually exempted from paying land revenue and other dues to the king, and was often given the right to collect these dues from the local people. Periplus is a Greek word meaning sailing around and Erythraean was the Greek. Languages and scripts. Most Azokan inscriptions were in the Prakrit language, while those in the northwest of the subcontinent were in Aramaic and Greek. Most Prakrit inscriptions were written in the Brahmi script, however, some, in the northwest, were written in Kharosthi. The Aramaic and Greek scripts were used for inscriptions in Afghanistan. Source 1. What the king's officials did. Here is an excerpt from the account of Megasthens. Of the great officers of state, some superintend the rivers, measure the land, as is done in Egypt, and inspect the sluices by which water is let out from the main canals into their branches, so that every one may have an equal supply of it. The same persons have charge also of the huntsmen, and are entrusted with the power of rewarding or punishing them according to their deserts. They collect the taxes, and superintend the occupations connected with land, as those of the woodcutters, the carpenters, the blacksmiths, and the miners. Source 2. Capturing elephants for the army. The Arthashastra lays down minute details of administrative and military organization. This is what it says about how to capture elephants. Guards of elephant forests, assisted by those who rear elephants, those who enchain the legs of elephants, those who guard the boundaries, those who live in forests, as well as by those who nurse elephants, shall, with the help of 5 or 7 female elephants to help in tethering wild ones, trace the whereabouts of herds of elephants by following the course of urine and dung left by elephants. According to Greek sources, the Mauryan ruler had a standing army of 600,000 foot soldiers, 30,000 cavalry, and 9,000 elephants. Some historians consider these accounts to be exaggerated. Chiefs and chiefdoms. A chief is a powerful man whose position may or may not be hereditary. He derives support from his kinfolk. His functions may include performing special rituals, leadership in warfare, and arbitrating disputes. He receives gifts from his subordinates, unlike kings who usually collect taxes, and often distributes these amongst his supporters. Generally, there are no regular armies and officials in chiefdoms. Source 3. The Pandya chief Sengutavan visits the forest. This is an excerpt from the Silapadikaram, an epic written in Tamil. When he visited the forest, people came down the mountain, singing and dancing, just as the defeated show respect to the victorious king, so did they bring gifts: ivory, fragrant wood, fans made of the hair of deer, honey, sandalwood, red ochre, antimony, turmeric, cardamom, pepper, etc. They brought coconuts, mangoes, medicinal plants, fruits, onions, sugar cane, flowers, areca nut, bananas, baby tigers, lions, elephants, monkeys, bear, deer, musk deer, fox, peacocks, musk cat, wild cocks, speaking parrots, etc. Source 4. In praise of Samudragupta. This is an excerpt from the Prayaga Prashasti. He was without an antagonist on earth. He, by the overflowing of the multitude of his many good qualities adorned by hundreds of good actions, has wiped off the fame of other kings with the solace of his feet. He is Purusha, the Supreme Being, being the cause of the prosperity of the good and the destruction of the bad. He is incomprehensible. He is one whose tender heart can be captured only by devotion and humility. He is possessed of compassion. He is the giver of many hundred thousands of cows. His mind has received ceremonial initiation for the uplift of the miserable, the poor, the forlorn, and the suffering. He is resplendent and embodied kindness to mankind. He is equal to the gods, Kabura, the god of wealth, Varuna, the god of the ocean, Indra, the god of rains, and Yama, the god of death. Source 5. The Sudarshana, beautiful, lake in Gujarat. Find Girnar on map 2. The Sudarshana lake was an artificial reservoir. We know about it from a rock inscription, c. 2nd century CE, in Sanskrit, composed to record the achievements of the Shaka ruler Rudradaman. The inscription mentions that the lake, with embankments and water channels, was built by a local governor during the rule of the Mauryas. However, a terrible storm broke the embankments and water gushed out of the lake. Rudradaman, who was then ruling in the area, claimed to have got the lake repaired using his own resources, without imposing any tax on his subjects. Another inscription on the same rock, c. 5th century, mentions how one of the rulers of the Gupta dynasty got the lake repaired once again. Source 6. The importance of boundaries. The Manusmriti is one of the best-known legal texts of early India, written in Sanskrit and compiled between c. 2nd century BCE and c. 2nd century CE. This is what the text advises the king to do. Seeing that in the world controversies constantly arise due to the ignorance of boundaries, he should have concealed boundary markers, buried stones, bones, cow's hair, chaff, ashes, potsherds, dried cow dung, bricks, coal, pebbles and sand. He should also have other similar substances that would not decay in the soil buried as hidden markers at the intersection of boundaries. Gahapati. A Gahapati was the owner, master, or head of a household, who exercised control over the women, children, slaves, and workers who shared a common residence. He was also the owner of the resources, land, animals, and other things that belonged to the household. Sometimes the term was used as a marker of status for men belonging to the urban elite, including wealthy merchants. Source 7. Life in a small village. The Harshakarita is a biography of Harshavardhana, the ruler of Kanauj, composed in Sanskrit by his court poet, Banabhata, c. 7th century CE. This is an excerpt from the text, an extremely rare representation of life in a settlement on the outskirts of a forest in the Vindhyas. The outskirts being for the most part forest, many parcels of riceland, threshing ground and arable land were being apportioned by small farmers. It was mainly spade culture, owing to the difficulty of ploughing the sparsely scattered fields covered with grass, with their few clear spaces, their black soil stiff as black iron. There were people moving along with bundles of bark, countless sacks of plucked flowers, loads of flax and hemp bundles, quantities of honey, peacock's tail feathers, wreaths of wax, logs, and grass. Village wives hastened en route for neighboring villages, all intent on thoughts of sale and bearing on their heads baskets filled with various gathered forest fruits. Source 8. Prabhavati Gupta and the village of Dangana. This is what Prabhavati Gupta states in her inscription. Prabhavati Gupta commands the Gramakutumbinas, householders/peasants living in the village, Brahmanas and others living in the village of Dangana. Be it known to you that on the 12th lunar day of the bright fortnight of Kartika, we have, in order to increase our religious merit, donated this village with the pouring out of water, to the Acharya, teacher, Chanalas Vaman. You should obey all, his commands. We confer on him the following exemptions typical of an agrahara. This village is not to be entered by soldiers and policemen. It is exempt from the obligation to provide grass, animal hides as seats, and charcoal to touring royal officers, exempt from the royal prerogative of purchasing fermenting liquors and digging salt, exempt from the right to mines and catara trees, exempt from the obligation to supply flowers and milk. It is donated, together with the right to hidden treasures and deposits, and together with major and minor taxes. This charter has been written in the 13th regnal year. It has been engraved by Chakradasa. The history of Pataliputra. Each city had a history of its own. Pataliputra, for instance, began as a village known as Patalagrama. Then, in the 5th century BCE, the Magadhan rulers decided to shift their capital from Rajagaha to this settlement and renamed it. By the 4th century BCE, it was the capital of the Mauryan Empire and one of the largest cities in Asia. Subsequently, its importance apparently declined. When the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang visited the city in the 7th century CE, he found it in ruins, and with a very small population. Source 9. The Malabar Coast, present-day Kerala. Here is an excerpt from Peri Plus. Of the Erythraean Sea, composed by an anonymous Greek sailor, c. 1st century CE. They, i.e. traders from abroad, send large ships to these market towns on account of the great quantity and bulk of pepper and malabathrum, possibly cinnamon, produced in these regions. There are imported here, in the first place, a great quantity of coin, topaz, antimony, a mineral used as a coloring substance, coral, crude glass, copper, tin, lead. There is exported pepper, which is produced in quantity in only one region near these markets. Besides this, there are exported great quantities of fine pearls, ivory, silk cloth, transparent stones of all kinds, diamonds and sapphires, and tortoise shell. Archaeological evidence of a bead-making industry, using precious and semi-precious stones, has been found in Kajamanal, Tamil Nadu. It is likely that local traders brought the stones mentioned in the Peri Plus from sites such as these to the coastal ports. 5. Numismatics is the study of coins, including visual elements such as scripts and images, metallurgical analysis, and the contexts in which they have been found. Source 10. The Orders of the King. Thus speaks King Devanampiya Payadasi. In the past, there were no arrangements for disposing affairs, nor for receiving regular reports. But I have made the following arrangement. Padivdakas should report to me about the affairs of the people at all times, anywhere, whether I am eating, in the inner apartment, in the bedroom, in the cow pen, being carried, possibly in a palanquin, or in the garden. And I will dispose of the affairs of the people everywhere. Source 11. The Anguish of the King. When the king Devanampiya Payadasi had been ruling for 8 years, the country of the Kalinas, present-day coastal Orissa, was conquered by him. 150,000 men were deported, 100,000 were killed, and many more died. After that, now that the country of the Kalinas has been taken, Devanampiya is devoted to an intense study of Dhamma, to the love of Dhamma, and to instructing the people in Dhamma. This is the repentance of Devanampiya on account of his conquest of the country of the Kalinas. For this is considered very painful and deplorable by Devanampiya that, while one is conquering an unconquered country, slaughter, death, and deportation of people take place there. Theme: kinship, caste, and class. 3 Early societies. c. 600 BCE to 600 CE. In the previous chapter we saw that there were several changes in economic and political life between c. 600 BCE and 600 CE. Some of these changes influenced societies as well. For instance, the extension of agriculture into forested areas transformed the lives of forest dwellers. Craft specialists often emerged as distinct social groups. The unequal distribution of wealth sharpened social differences. Historians often use textual traditions to understand these processes. Some texts lay down norms of social behavior, others describe and occasionally comment on a wide range of social situations and practices. We can also catch a glimpse of some social actors from inscriptions. As we will see, each text, an inscription, was written from the perspective of specific social categories. So we need to keep in mind who composed what and for whom. We also need to consider the language used, and the ways in which the text circulated. Used carefully, texts allow us to piece together attitudes and practices that shape social histories. In focusing on the Mahabharata, a colossal epic running in its present form into over 100,000 verses with depictions of a wide range of social categories and situations, we draw on one of the richest texts of the subcontinent. It was composed over a period of about 1,000 years, c. 500 BCE onwards, and some of the stories it contains may have been in circulation even earlier. The central story is about two sets of warring cousins. The text also contains sections laying down norms of behavior for various social groups. Occasionally, though not always, the principal characters seem to follow these norms. What does conformity with norms and deviations from them signify? 1. The critical edition of the Mahabharata. One of the most ambitious projects of scholarship began in 1919, under the leadership of a noted Indian Sanskritist, V.S. Sukthankar. A team comprising dozens of scholars initiated the task of preparing a critical edition of the Mahabharata. What exactly did this involve? Initially, it meant collecting Sanskrit manuscripts of the text, written in a variety of scripts, from different parts of the country. The team worked out a method of comparing verses from each manuscript. Ultimately, they selected the verses that appeared common to most versions and published these in several volumes, running into over 13,000 pages. The project took 47 years to complete. Two things became apparent. There were several common elements in the Sanskrit versions of the story, evident in manuscripts found all over the subcontinent, from Kashmir and Nepal in the north to Kerala and Tamil Nadu in the south. Also evident were enormous regional variations in the ways in which the text had been transmitted over the centuries. These variations were documented in footnotes and appendices to the main text. Taken together, more than half the 13,000 pages are devoted to these variations. In a sense, these variations are reflective of the complex processes that shaped early, and later, social histories through dialogues between dominant traditions and resilient local ideas and practices. These dialogues are characterized by moments of conflict as well as consensus. Our understanding of these processes is derived primarily from texts written in Sanskrit by and for Brahmanas. When issues of social history were explored for the first time by historians in the 19th and 20th centuries, they tended to take these texts at face value, believing that everything that was laid down in these texts was actually practiced. Subsequently, scholars began studying other traditions, from works in Pali, Prakrit, and Tamil. These studies indicated that the ideas contained in normative Sanskrit texts were on the whole recognized as authoritative. They were also questioned and occasionally even rejected. It is important to keep this in mind as we examine how historians reconstruct social histories. 2. Kinship and marriage. Many rules and varied practices. 2.1 Finding out about families. We often take family life for granted. However, you may have noticed that not all families are identical. They vary in terms of numbers of members, their relationship with one another, as well as the kinds of activities they share. Often people belonging to the same family share food and other resources, and live, work and perform rituals together. Families are usually parts of larger networks of people defined as relatives, or to use a more technical term, kinfolk. While familial ties are often regarded as natural and based on blood, they are defined in many different ways. For instance, Some societies regard cousins as being blood relations, whereas others do not. For early societies, historians can retrieve information about elite families fairly easily. It is, however, far more difficult to reconstruct the familial relationships of ordinary people. Historians also investigate and analyze attitudes towards family and kinship. These are important, because they provide an insight into people's thinking. It is likely that some of these ideas would have shaped their actions, just as actions may have led to changes in attitudes. 2.2 The ideal of patrilineal. Can we identify points when kinship relations changed? At one level, the Mahabharata is a story about this. It describes a feud over land and power between two groups of cousins, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, who belonged to a single ruling family, that of the Kurus, a lineage dominating one of the Janapadas. Ultimately, the conflict ended in a battle, in which the Pandavas emerged victorious. After that, patrilineal succession was proclaimed. While patrilineal had existed prior to the composition of the epic, the central story of the Mahabharata reinforced the idea that it was valuable. Under patrilineal, sons could claim the resources, including the throne in the case of kings, of their fathers when the latter died. Most ruling dynasties, c. 6th century BCE onwards, claimed to follow this system, although there were variations in practice. Sometimes there were no sons, in some situations brothers succeeded one another, sometimes other kinsmen claimed the throne, and, in very exceptional circumstances, women such as Prabhavati Gupta exercised power. The concern with patrilineal was not unique to ruling families. It is evident in mantras and ritual texts such as the Rigveda. It is possible that these attitudes were shared by wealthy men and those who claimed high status, including Brahmanas. 2.3 Rules of marriage. While sons were important for the continuity of the patrilineage, daughters were viewed rather differently within this framework. They had no claims to the resources of the household. At the same time, marrying them into families outside the kin was considered desirable. This system, called exogamy, literally, marrying outside, meant that the lives of young girls and women belonging to families that claimed high status were often carefully regulated to ensure that they were married at the right time and to the right person. This gave rise to the belief that Kanyadana, or the gift of a daughter in marriage, was an important religious duty of the father. With the emergence of new towns, social life became more complex. People from near and far met to buy and sell their products and share ideas in the urban milieu. This may have led to a questioning of earlier beliefs and practices. Faced with this challenge, the Brahmanas responded by laying down codes of social behavior in great detail. These were meant to be followed by Brahmanas in particular and the rest of society in general. From c. 500 BCE, these norms were compiled in Sanskrit texts known as the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. The most important of such works, the Manusmriti, was compiled between c. 200 BCE and 200 CE. While the Brahmana authors of these texts claimed that their point of view had universal validity and that what they prescribed had to be obeyed by everybody, it is likely that real social relations were more complicated. Besides, given the regional diversity within the subcontinent and the difficulties of communication, the influence of Brahmanas was by no means all-pervasive. What is interesting is that the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras recognized as many as 8 forms of marriage. Of these, the first 4 were considered as good while the remaining were condemned. It is possible that these were practiced by those who did not accept Brahmanical norms. 2.4 The Gotra of women. One Brahmanical practice, evident from c. 1000 BCE onwards, was to classify people, especially Brahmanas, in terms of gotras. Each gotra was named after a Vedic seer, and all those who belonged to the same gotra were regarded as his descendants. 2 rules about gotra were particularly important. Women were expected to give up their father's gotra and adopt that of their husband on marriage, and members of the same gotra could not marry. One way to find out whether this was commonly followed is to consider the names of men and women, which were sometimes derived from gotra names. These names are available for powerful ruling lineages such as the Satavahanas who ruled over parts of western India and the Deccan, c. 2nd century BC - 2nd century CE. Several of their inscriptions have been recovered, which allow historians to trace family ties, including marriages. Some of the Satavahana rulers were polygynous, that is, had more than one wife. An examination of the names of women who married Satavahana rulers indicates that many of them had names derived from Gotras such as Gotama and Vasistha, their fathers' Gotras. They evidently retained these names instead of adopting names derived from their husband's Gotra name as they were required to do according to the Brahmanical rules. What is also apparent is that some of these women belonged to the same Gotra. As is obvious, this ran counter to the ideal of exogamy recommended in the Brahmanical texts. In fact, it exemplified an alternative practice, that of endogamy or marriage within the kin group, which was, and is, prevalent amongst several communities in South India. Such marriages amongst kinfolk, such as cousins, ensured a close-knit community. It is likely that there were variations in other parts of the subcontinent as well, but as yet it has not been possible to reconstruct specific details. 2.5 Were mothers important? We have seen that Satavahana rulers were identified through metronymics, names derived from that of the mother. Although this may suggest that mothers were important, we need to be cautious before we arrive at any conclusion. In the case of the Satavahanas we know that succession to the throne was generally patrilineal. 3. Social differences. Within and beyond the framework of caste. You are probably familiar with the term caste, which refers to a set of hierarchically ordered social categories. The ideal order was laid down in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. Brahmanas claimed that this order, in which they were ranked first, was divinely ordained, while placing groups classified as Shudras and untouchables at the very bottom of the social order. Positions within the order were supposedly determined by birth. 3.1 The right occupation. The Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras also contained rules about the ideal occupations of the four categories or varnas. Brahmanas were supposed to study and teach the Vedas, perform sacrifices and get sacrifices performed, and give and receive gifts. Kshatriyas were to engage in warfare, protect people and administer justice, study the Vedas, get sacrifices performed, and make gifts. The last three occupations were also assigned to the Vaishyas, who were in addition expected to engage in agriculture, pastoralism, and trade. Shudras were assigned only one occupation, that of serving the three higher varnas. The Brahmanas evolved 2 or 3 strategies for enforcing these norms. 1, as we have just seen, was to assert that the varna order was of divine origin. 2nd, they advised kings to ensure that these norms were followed within their kingdoms. And 3rd, they attempted to persuade people that their status was determined by birth. However, this was not always easy. So prescriptions were often reinforced by stories told in the Mahabharata and other texts. 3.2 On Kshatriya kings. According to the Shastras, only Kshatriyas could be kings. However, several important ruling lineages probably had different origins. The social background of the Mauryas, who ruled over a large empire, has been hotly debated. While later Buddhist texts suggested they were Kshatriyas, Brahmanical texts described them as being of low origin. The Shungas and Kanvas, the immediate successors of the Mauryas, were Brahmanas. In fact, political power was effectively open to anyone who could muster support and resources, and rarely depended on birth as a Kshatriya. Other rulers, such as the Shakas who came from Central Asia, were regarded as mlechchas, barbarians, or outsiders by the Brahmanas. However, one of the earliest inscriptions in Sanskrit describes how Rudradaman, the best-known Shaka ruler, c. 2nd century CE, rebuilt Sudarshana Lake. This suggests that powerful mlechchas were familiar with Sanskritic traditions. It is also interesting that the best-known ruler of the Satavahana dynasty, Gautamiputta Sirisattakani, claimed to be both a unique Brahmana, aka Bamhana, and a destroyer of the